Okay, welcome everybody to the Butterfield National Historic Trail across Arkansas. Our instructor today is Bob Crossman, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about himself. But after graduating from Russell High School, Dr. Crossman received a BA from Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas, and received graduate and postgraduate degrees from SMU in Dallas, Texas. He is the author of 6 books on the Butterfield, and he's going to go into a little bit more detail about this. We will share this recording with you after the class, so you can go back and catch anything you may have missed or want to listen to again. And we will keep this video live for about 2 weeks, and then we will take it off of YouTube. It will be an unlisted link, and we do ask that you do not share this with anybody outside. So welcome, Dr. Crossman, and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you. As she mentioned, I do live in Conway, Arkansas, and Marcia and I have been married for 52 years. We were just 19 when our parents let us get married. But fortunately, we waited 5 years before we had any children. We do have 2 boys and 5 grandchildren. And fortunately, they all live within 30 minutes of us here in Conway. And we get to see our grandchildren and go to lots of ball games because they're at that age. They're playing baseball or football or volleyball or basketball just constantly. So since 1973, I've been a United Methodist pastor. For 30 years, I served local churches. And up near Fayetteville, I was at Brightwater and Tux Chapel, the pastor up there. I was also the pastor at Avoca, but they merged with Brightwater the week before I got there. But that's right up there near the university. For 10 years, I served at the state and national level with the Methodist Church before retiring after 40 years of service. And that was 10 years ago. And so for the last 10 years, I've been able to pursue one of my favorite interests from college, and that is history, and been able to study our topic for today, the Butterfield Overland Mail. And the way I got into studying the Overland Mail was sort of a strange route. It was through my postage stamp collection. A stamp collector friend, John Birkenbein, was looking through one of my albums. And when he got to the 1859 stamps and envelopes, John said, "Oh, you have a Butterfield envelope." And I said, "What's a Butterfield envelope?" And looking at this envelope for my collection, he revealed to me that this envelope was carried through Arkansas in November of 1860 on the Butterfield stagecoaches. And he also revealed the route to me through Arkansas and Missouri and Oklahoma and Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and California. And that's when I discovered that I have lived within a quarter mile or so of the historic Butterfield Trail most of my adult life. And so for the last 10 years, since John revealed this to me, I have focused my stamp collection on collecting letters and envelopes that were carried through Arkansas on the Butterfield stagecoaches. And these are some of the letters and envelopes that I have that were carried through Arkansas in 1858, 59, 60, and 61 on the Butterfield stagecoaches. And this 10-year research has also resulted in 7 books now on the Butterfield stage. And that's kind of how I got into studying our topic for today. Well, let me begin with the main subject today with an introduction on why the Butterfield Historic Trail route was established in the first place. And the reason the Butterfield Overland Mail route was established goes back to the gold rush in 1848. The discovery of gold began a migration of hundreds, thousands of people from Arkansas and all across the country going to California in hopes of finding their fortune for their families. And it was mostly men who traveled to the gold fields, and that left the women back at home to continue to operate the farm. And the only way to communicate between the men in the California gold fields and the family, wives, sweethearts, children back in Arkansas was by writing a letter. The gold rush resulted in thousands of people trying to get letters to and from California. Now, this is 1848, 1858, long before communications and travel were so simple as it is today. To get a letter to California, if you took your letter to the Fayetteville Post Office or the Green Grove Post Office or the Fort Smith Post Office addressed to California to your loved one, it would be carried to either Boston or New Orleans, and it would be placed on a ship. Twice a month, ships would leave New Orleans and Boston to head toward California. Now, they would either take 4 to 6 months to go all the way around the southern tip of South America, or they would take a couple of months to go to Panama. The passengers and mail would be unloaded, carried across the Isthmus of Panama to the Pacific side, where they would wait for another ship that would eventually carry them up toward San Francisco, and that would take a couple of months. Those routes were not guaranteed. Storms, ships were lost making these journeys, but that was the fastest way to get mail to California. Or you could find a wagon train that was going to be leaving Fort Smith or Clarksville this coming October, and you would give your letter to someone on that wagon train, maybe a few extra coins, in hopes that they would enter it into the mail system once they got to California. That was the only way to communicate with loved ones in the gold field, or to get to the gold fields yourself. And so increasing pressure was brewing from California to establish a more reliable and faster means of communication with loved ones back home. So finally, in 1857, the federal government, through the post office, decided to establish this formal route, and advertisements were put out asking for bids for the job. The 9 different firms bid on the contract. It was John Butterfield, an established stageman from New York, who received the contract. 6-year contract, $600,000 a year, if he could deliver the mail twice a week in less than 25 days. So John Butterfield signed the contract. He had exactly 52 weeks to get all of this put together to make it happen. Signed the contract in September of 57. The stage was to begin the middle of September 1858. The first thing John Butterfield had to do is to figure out the route. There was no Interstate 40 in 1858. How was he going to get from Memphis and St. Louis, merge in Little Rock or Fort Smith or Preston, Texas, and get all the way to San Francisco? What route was he going to take? Well, fortunately for John Butterfield, when it came to the route across the middle of Arkansas, that route was already available. A military road had been constructed from Memphis to Fort Smith in the late 1820s. It was a military road built so that troops could be more quickly transported from Fort Pike in Little Rock to Fort Smith or on to Fort Gibson in Indian Territory. And so that trail existed. 16 feet wide, right through the forest of Arkansas. There were also two historic trails from Fort Smith down to Fort Smith, from Fort Smith to Fayetteville. And so though it was a rather simple choice on how he was going to get across the state of Arkansas. As you got out west, it was a different situation, but he did rely primarily on what was called the Southern Immigrant Trail to get from West Texas to California. Several dozen segments of this road still survive. The longest is just north of Paris, Arkansas. Connects Paris and New Blaine. Maybe it's 24 miles long and looks much like what you see on your screen right now. In the Delta and in muddy spots, they didn't just have a dirt road because it would just be mud. They would make what's called a plank road or corduroy road by laying logs side by side, covering the logs with dirt, sloped so that water would run off onto the sides. And it was bumpy, but it was better than 5 feet of mud trying to get through the Delta of Arkansas. Now, this map is from 1852, 6 years before the Butterfield Historic Trail started. And so maps like this were available to John Butterfield as he tried to determine the route across Arkansas. It wasn't like he had to just trudge through the forest himself without any guide on what Arkansas looked like. So between Fort Smith and Memphis, that military road, well, here's Northwest Arkansas. He primarily chose this blue route going from the Missouri line south of Joplin to get to Fort Smith. As I mentioned earlier, there were two ways to get from Fayetteville to Van Buren, and one was longer but smoother, and the other was shorter but rougher. Well, since speed was a primary concern, Butterfield chose the shorter, rougher route, and that's in blue. And I believe I've got the longer, rougher, the longer, smoother route indicated here with the red dotted lines. But Butterfield basically chose this blue line using those existing roads to get from the Missouri state line down to Van Buren and on to Fort Smith. To get from Memphis to Fort Smith, you see the old military road here in red. There was a newer road that connected Memphis through Des Arc and bypassed Little Rock. And so that's the route that Butterfield chose, is to go on this green line through eastern Arkansas, and then meeting up at Cadron, Conway, with the Butterfield route going on across. You'll notice it doesn't go to Little Rock. And after the first 4 weeks of operation, folks in Little Rock were quite upset. They were able to take the hangar stage line, and passengers and mail could be carried up from Little Rock to meet the stagecoach, but that wasn't very acceptable. And so because of that pressure, after the first month of operation, the route was changed so that they used the green line to Oakland Grove, and then took this blue road south through what we call Jacksonville to Little Rock. And that's where they picked up the old military road coming north through Faulkner County and then on, as originally planned, toward Fort Smith. To be able to travel this route pretty much day and night without stopping much, they established stations about every 17 miles or so across the state of Arkansas. Because Arkansas was fairly settled by 1858, they were able to use established places already. They didn't have to build them from scratch. Sometimes they used existing hotels. Other times they would find an individual like Samuel Plummer or Kirkbride Potts who had a significant house with a room in their stables for additional horses, and they would pay them $125 to $150 a quarter, which was significant money back then, to be a station for the Butterfield stage. And to be a station, they had to keep 4, 8, 12 horses year round, feed them, care for them. And every time the stage came through, they had 10 minutes to rush out with a fresh team of horses, change the horses, grease the axles, and the stagecoach would then hurry on its way. And so these stations were established. Now, originally, to get across the middle of Arkansas, John Butterfield had a great idea: the Arkansas River. And so he thought he could use the Arkansas River to carry mail and passengers from Fort Smith all the way down the Arkansas to Napoleon, and then up the Mississippi to Memphis. And passengers and the mail would go on a steamboat. He thought passengers would love it, that have a bed to sleep in, that have a dining room. It would be a casual, comfortable cruise from Fort Smith to Memphis. And so he bought a steamboat called the Jenny Whipple, and that was his plan. I was fortunate to purchase this painting. It hangs in my office. I found it up in Des Moines, Iowa, from the original owners. It was painted by Ralph Law. This was a great plan of Butterfield's. He even wrote the board up in New York of the Overland Mail Company and told them this would be more profitable to use a steamboat because they wouldn't have to have employees stationed from Fort Smith to Memphis. They wouldn't have to be paying $120 to $150 a quarter to 20, 24 different stations from Memphis to Fort Smith. They wouldn't have to have horses stocked. They wouldn't have to buy wagons for that route. He thought it'd be more profitable to just carry them on his steamboat. Great idea. Except he forgot to tell the Arkansas River what his plan was. So when September 18 rolled around and it was time for the route to start up, the Arkansas River was so low that he could not even get his steamboat to Fort Smith or to Memphis to carry the mail. And so he hastily had to contract with an existing stageman here in Arkansas called J.T. Chittister to carry the mail for him between Fort Smith and Memphis. Chittister had a number of mail contracts already, and so he already had a route from Fort Smith to Memphis, and he would just kind of do double duty and carry passengers and mail along with his other contract mail between Memphis and Fort Smith. And so September 58 arrived. He's had 52 weeks to put all this together. He has the route established from St. Louis and Memphis, decided to merge in Fort Smith instead of Little Rock or Preston, Texas, merging in Fort Smith, going all the way to San Francisco, 3,134 miles, including 322 miles from Memphis to Fort Smith. He set up 136 stagecoach stations for the change of horses. Later, he would increase that to 175 stations. He purchased 34 stagecoaches and 66 lighter weight stagecoaches called celerity wagons. We'll talk about more about that in just a moment. And he hired hundreds of drivers and conductors, station keepers, blacksmiths, mechanics, wheelwrights, helpers, herders, veterinarians, armed guards, harness makers, and scattered these employees all along this 3,000-mile route. And he did all of that in 52 weeks. I don't know how in the world he did that. If someone had a contract to do that today in 52 weeks, I don't know if they could even accomplish it today with all of the communication we have and all of our travel capabilities. But John Butterfield put all of this together in 52 weeks. And so when the contract called for them to start in September of 1858, they were ready to go. And on this map, I have shown some of the stations here across Arkansas that were set up, stocked with horses, employees, contract signed, ready to go. During the 130 weeks of operation, about 520 times, stagecoaches were either heading east or west on this circuit, stopping at each of these stations 520 times for a quick change of horses as they sped along this route. After about 20 years of effort and Senator John Bozeman joining, they were successful in getting this trail established as the Butterfield Overland National Historic Trail. And I believe it was signed by the president in January of 2023. An official schedule was set up by John's son, Daniel. He took a roll of paper 60 feet long, laid out all the stations. He set the times between each of the stations. These were the major stops and the times for going west and going east, how many miles they would go between these particular stations, how many hours and minutes were allowed to get from one station to the next. And the schedule was all set up and it was published. And so each of these stages could carry up to 9 people inside, could carry a couple more on the top, on the roof. They could carry up to 12,000 letters, about 500 pounds of mail as well. And so this resulted in 6 stages going every way, each week, going each direction, 14 stagecoaches on the road at any given time. And they would make this trip in 21 to 23 days. Now, when we think of a stagecoach, we usually think of the kind that John Wayne had in his movies, being pulled by horses. But they didn't use horses most of the time. They had 2 kinds of draft animals they used, either teams of 4 to 6 horses to pull the stagecoaches, or in more difficult areas, such as in Northwest Arkansas and all of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, they used mules to carry the overland mail. So there were 2 different kinds of draft animals used, but there were also 2 different kinds of stagecoaches. One of them there at the top is kind of the traditional stagecoach we think of, that's in all the John Wayne movies. It's called a Concord mail coach. They were constructed in Concord, New Hampshire. They were made of hickory. They had a reddish brown leather interior, had cushions, side curtains, and each coach could carry 4,000 pounds of passengers and mail. And John Butterfield ordered 34 of these from J.B. Abbott in Concord, New Hampshire. Now, they were made all over the country, knockoffs, but the best ones were made by J.B. Abbott in Concord, New Hampshire. And these were shipped to Fort Smith and then distributed along the way. In rougher parts of the country, Northwest Arkansas and Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, a lighter weight stage was used. This is the only photograph in existence of an actual lightweight stage used by John Butterfield. The picture was made near Midland, Texas. The interior was similar, but it had a canvas oilcloth roof. So it was lighter weight. Couldn't carry passengers or mail on the top, but it would make it through rougher parts of the trip. Pulled by mules. And 66 of these lightweight stages were ordered. Also, Butterfield had to get some water wagons. In parts of the desert Southwest, there were no creeks or streams, and so cisterns were dug at these primitive stations. Water wagons were used to carry water as far as 60 and 90 miles. To fill the cisterns for the animals and for the employees and for the passengers. There was another piece of equipment, and that was a stage post horn. Every conductor on the stage had a horn, and they would blow this horn about a mile from the station to signify, we are on the way. Get those new horses ready to go. And also the stage was on a tight schedule. If there was a wagon in front of them or foot traffic, they would blow the horn to signal, move to the side, we are coming through. In 1858, a passenger waxed poetic about these post horns, and this is what he wrote. This is 1859, a passenger wrote, "The blast of the stage horn, as it rolls through the valleys and over the prairies of the West, cheers and gladdens the hearts of the pioneers. As it sounds through the valleys, it sends a thrill of delight. The pioneer knows that it is bringing good tidings from the hearts and homes that he left behind. It binds him stronger and firmer to his beloved country. So regular is its arrival that the inhabitants of the West know almost the hour and the minute when the welcome sound of the post horn will reach them. The Overland is the most popular institution in the far West." So every stagecoach had a post horn. Now, not only were there two kinds of animals used, and not only were there two kinds of stagecoaches, there was also two kinds of stations. Every 17 miles on average, a stage pulled into a rustic swing station. 10 minutes were allowed for a quick change of horses and to grease the axles. Every 60 to 80 miles was a larger home station. Here, they didn't stop for 10 minutes. If time allowed, they would stop as much as 40 minutes. Passengers could stretch their legs, take advantage of the facilities, and even purchase a bite to eat. And also at the home station, the driver would get off and a new driver would get aboard. The old driver would spend a night or two and wait for the next stage headed in the opposite direction and would take charge of that stage, so that the driver had a 60-mile route that they traveled over and over and over again. And of course, the horses had the same route that they traveled over and over and over again, so that the driver and the horses knew the route so well, they could travel it even in the dark, in the middle of the night. Every 120 to 160 miles, the conductors would switch. The conductor would get off, spend a few days at that home station, waiting for the next stage headed in the opposite direction, would take charge of that stage. And so the conductor also had a route that they would repeat over and over and over again. In this next segment, we're going to walk through some of the stations between St. Louis and Fort Smith. But before we do that, let's pause for a minute. We're going to stop 3 times here for questions about every 20 minutes and see if there's any questions at this point. And there are just 4 of us, so you can turn on your microphone if you have a question. Or I think there is a way to use the chat feature if you want to ask a question by chat. You could do that too. Are there any questions at this point before we look at the St. Louis to Fort Smith route in greater detail?
I'm curious to know if Peter ever got mic or camera on his. He was complaining in the chat that he had no mic or no camera, which would mean forget it.
Peter's still with us. Can you hear us or see us, Peter?
Now, Peter has sound, and yeah, he said he did have sound. So anyway, but I'm curious.
You should be able, either at the top or the bottom of your screen, be able to click on video and see if that helps.
Yeah, I told him that. But anyway, apparently he has no questions because he did say he now had sound.
All right. Well, good. Okay.
So, and I'm curious about, I wasn't aware that there were 2 different kinds of coaches. because the ones going through all of Northwest Arkansas were apparently just the light canvas covered ones.
Yes, apparently they would switch at either Fayetteville or Park Station to the lighter weight stage, but the actual stagecoach was used through Missouri into Arkansas, at least as far as Fayetteville.
Okay.
I'll show you in a little bit an actual photograph made in Fayetteville of the Concord stagecoach used by Butterfield. In fact, John Butterfield's son is the driver. He's sitting on top of it. So, but the route south of Fayetteville was pretty rough, pretty rough. All right, we ready to look a little more detail between St. Louis and Fort Smith? Okay. Well, it is now, see if I can get back in here. There we go. It's now the middle of September. We're ready for the first day of operation. The Overland Mail was to leave St. Louis every Monday and Thursday at 8 o'clock in the morning. And they had 91 hours to get to Fort Smith. Now, fortunately in Missouri, they had 168 miles of train track. That's all they had. It did not reach Kansas City, but it got as far as Tipton. And so John Butterfield took advantage of the train, only traveled 13 miles an hour, but the mail and passengers were put on the train at St. Louis, and they would take that train all the way to the end of the tracks at Tipton, Missouri. At Tipton, they would transfer to the traditional stagecoach, and they would stop at 17 stations before they got to the Arkansas state line. And basically from Tipton to the Arkansas line, they traveled some of the well-known trails and military roads that were already in existence to get from Tipton to the Arkansas line. When the train arrived at Tipton, this is a painting from a mural in the post office at Tipton today. When the train arrived at Tipton, there was a actual reporter there, and they made record of what actually happened. And let me read you an account of what happened the very first day when the mail arrived. A few minutes after 6 o'clock in the evening, when young John Butterfield was in the driver's seat, a brand new coach drawn by 6 beautiful horses wheeled up to the railroad station in grand style. A whistle was heard, and in a few minutes, a little wood-burning locomotive appeared, belching smoke and vomiting flame from its huge funnel-shaped stack, and came snorting and clanking with its short train into the station from its 13-mile-an-hour dash from St. Louis. Mr. Butterfield stepped from the baggage car of the train with 2 little mail pouches slung over his arm and rapidly walked to the waiting stagecoach. He saw them and carefully placed the mail in the forward boot that's under the driver's feet. It was a thrilling moment. The horses strained and pawed at the hands of the men holding their heads. Mr. Butterfield gave a final inspection. He tightened a few harness buckles, reached up and gave his son a silent hand clasp, gave a signal to the conductor, and quickly sprang into the stagecoach. Exactly 9 minutes had been consumed for the transfer. The conductor sounded a call on his bugle, then mounted to the seat beside young John Butterfield. The horses were released, and the next moment, the first westbound Butterfield mail, amid the clatter of hoofs and a cloud of dust, whirled away, headed west into the golden sunset. The village spectators, little were they aware that history was being made at that moment. That was the first day of the first trip. 12 stations, 12 station stops before they reached Springfield, Missouri, and then only 5 more stops before they crossed into Arkansas. And on this 1852 map, which would have been available to John Butterfield when they were setting the route, you can see the roads that existed in 1852. I have placed some of the stations that Butterfield used between the state line and Fort Smith. A segment of the old road still exists within the Pea Ridge National Military Park up near the state line. And this photo was made just north of the Elkhorn Tavern. And shortly after entering Arkansas on this road, they would pass the 1833 home of John Ruddick, which still stands today, and we know as the Elkhorn Tavern. This is what the Elkhorn Tavern looks like today. You can see the trail there in front of the tavern. Now, this was not a normal stop for the Butterfield. Kirby Sanders called it a flag station, that if Elkhorn Tavern had passengers or mail, they would set a flag out by the road to tell the stage to stop for a moment because a passenger wanted to get on board or there was mail to be picked up. But the stagecoach did go past Elkhorn Tavern, but it was not a regular stop. Leaving the tavern, the stage continued southwest for a distance of about 10 miles, crossed this little Sugar Creek that's shown here, near the town of Brightwater. I lived in Brightwater for a while, and then went through the town that we now call Avoca. Today, you can still see a portion of the trail just north of Avoca, where it passes under this 1880 tunnel that's underneath the St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad tracks. In some places here in Northwest Arkansas by Avoca, that old road still exists under the pavement, and it's called the Old Wire Road. And the reason it's called the Old Wire Road is 10 years or so after the Butterfield, the telegraph line was laid, and they followed the existing highway, which was the old military road, laying the telegraph wire, And so instead of being called the old military road, folks just began to call it the Old Wire Road, because that's the road where the wire was carrying the telegraph. There's some controversy about the location of the first station in Arkansas, Callahan's. Years ago, folks thought it was at the old Electric Springs Hotel. It was thought that Dennis Callahan chose this site in 1844 by the gushing clear 3-spring electric springs to build Callahan Station. In 1881, the Electric Springs Hotel had a beautiful grand stairway. It was a popular health destination, kind of like we think of Hot Springs, Arkansas, was Electric Springs Hotel. The healing powers of the water were touted about. And this hotel stood until 1941 when it was removed. On the other hand, Kirby Sanders believes that the Callahan Station was at what we now call 506 East Spruce Street, where the Human Concern Building now stands instead of at the Electric Hotel. And this is a picture from 506 Spring Street from Google. And leaving Callahan Station at this site, the stage headed south toward Fayetteville, about 25 miles, would take them about 3 hours. And on the way south, the stage passed through Cross Hollows in Lowell, used to be called Mudtown. I think it was also called Bloomington at one point. And this photo of Cross Hollows shows the stretch of the Butterfield Trail that remains today. Leaving Callahan's, they passing through Mudtown. The next stop was at Fitzgerald Station. It's amazing that part of Fitzgerald Station still survives, and that is this stone barn that was rented, leased by Butterfield to keep horses in. And the stage would stop here in what we now call Springdale for a change of horses and to have the axles greased. The barn is still standing. Now, next to the barn is a home that was built about 10 years later after the Butterfield time. And it's a beautiful structure standing there, but the Butterfield stage never saw that home. It was 10 years later. This is inside that barn. I understand that the insides is still just like it was back in Butterfield's day, and that Butterfield paid Fitzgerald to keep 4 to 12 of his horses there round the clock, year round, so they would be ready when the next stage came through. From Fitzgerald Station, the stage headed south to Fayetteville. In Fayetteville, Butterfield constructed a hotel, a livery stable, station, several large barns there in Fayetteville. He loved Fayetteville. One of his sons, Charles, moved to Fayetteville and had a home there in Fayetteville. A passenger on the very first day, William Ormsby, wrote a word about Fayetteville. He writes, "Fayetteville is located among the hills in a most inaccessible spot. It has 2 churches, the county courthouse, a number of fine stores and dwellings, and about 1,800 inhabitants. It is a flourishing little town, but it lacks a good hotel. I understand that will be supplied by Mr. Butterfield, who has bought some property for this purpose." And Butterfield did build a hotel there in Fayetteville. Now, Marilyn Hefner, using the old census records, was able to discover that the house Charles Butterfield lived in is still standing, and this is it. Charles Butterfield served as a senior superintendent overseeing the entire line, all the 8 superintendents of the whole line. And we have a photograph of this home where Charles Butterfield lived that was taken on the very first day of operations, about September 21 of 1858. And that's this photograph right here. This photograph was discovered by Gerald Anhurt in an old newspaper. The article with the newspaper said it was taken on the first day of operation in September of 1858. And this is the only photograph that exists of Butterfield used traditional mail stagecoach. The caption says that John Butterfield's son, John Butterfield Jr., is sitting there on the driver's seat. And this is Charles Butterfield's home. This home right here is that home right there, taken in 1858. And so from Fayetteville, they followed this blue line, headed south, and that square box is the rough part of the trip. It came to be known as the most difficult 10 miles of the entire 3,000-mile trip all the way to San Francisco. But these 10 miles were the roughest part of the way. From Fayetteville, Butterfield passed through Hog-Eye to reach Parks Station, which was the next official station. This photograph was taken at Park Station just before the building was lost in a fire. And because there was going to be a rough stretch of road just south of here, if they hadn't switched at Fayetteville, they would switch at Park Station to the lighter weight Celerity wagon. And this sketch from October of 1858 shows the transfer of mail and passengers from the traditional stagecoach in the back to the Celerity wagon pulled by mules there in the front. In 1858, Waterman Ormsby, passenger, described the passage over this rough section of the road. He wrote, "The wiry, light little animals tugged and pulled as if they would tear themselves to pieces, and our heavy wagon bounded along the crags as if it would be shaken in pieces every minute, and ourselves disemboweled on the spot. For 15 miles, the road winds among these mountains." The celerity wagons were pulled by mules, and this sketch, made by passenger William Hilton in 1858, is evident that the driver and conductor were having a great deal of problem with these 4 mules. They often used wild Mustang mules that were just right out of the wilderness for these wagons, and they had not really been broken in, so they did have some rough time. Also, there were some bad accidents because the mules misbehaving and charging off and crashing into a tree. But this was from 1858 by passenger William Hilton. South of Park Station, the stage passed another flag station called Strickler's. And from Strickler's, the Butterfield headed toward a narrow and rocky stretch to the crossing of Lee's Creek. And understand Strickler Station was dismantled some years ago and reconstructed in Siloam Springs. Like Elkhorn Tavern, it witnessed the Butterfield going by, but was not an official station. Ormsby referred to this segment of the road when he wrote, "I might say that our road was a steep, rugged, jagged, rough, and mountainous, and then wish for more expressive words." It was a tough part of the road. This is Hiram Rumfield. He was assistant treasurer of the Overland Mail Company. And in June of 1860, he wrote a letter to his wife that survives, and he described traveling over this part of the route south of Fayetteville. He writes to his wife, "No one who has ever passed over this road can form any idea of its bold and rugged aspect." Excuse me. "It winds along the mountainside over a surface covered with masses of broken rock, and frequently runs in fearful proximity to a precipitous ravine of unknown depth. Over such a route as this," they went over this route going south in the dark, in the middle of the night. "Over such a route as this, the coaches of the mail company are driven with fearful rapidity. The horses are seldom permitted to walk. Even when traversing the steepest and most treacherous hills, and when drove at their utmost speed, which is generally the case, the stage reels from side to side like a storm-tossed bark, and the dim of the heavenly ironed wheels in constant contact with flinty rock is truly appalling. The man who passes over this route as passenger in one of the Overland Mail coaches without experiencing feelings of mingled terror and astonishment must certainly be oblivious to every consideration of his personal safety." It was the roughest part of the 3,000-mile trip. 20 miles south of Park Station, the Overland came toward Cedarville and reached Brody's Station, a mile south of the Lee Creek crossing. It was a 2-story double log cabin with a porch extending along the front, and was the home station of Hiram Brody. And there was a local blacksmith, Samuel Swearingen, who would shod horses as needed for Brody Station. From Brody Station, the Overland headed south to a site here called Woolsey Station, south of Cedarville in Crawford County. It was operated by George Woolsey. And Woolsey Station is one of the few Butterfield stations that was destroyed during the Civil War. On December 28, 1862, As Confederate soldiers were retreating south after the Battle of Prairie Grove, Union troops caught up to them at Woolsey Station, and the Battle of Dripping Springs began, resulting in the burning of Woolsey Station. And this escapade ended up at the port of Van Buren. George Woolsey's son, W.W. Woolsey, was killed at the Battle of Prairie Grove and is buried near this station. From Woolsey Station, the route headed south about 10 miles down a steep hill to enter Van Buren. At the top of that hill, known as Signal Hill, the driver would blow the horn to warn citizens that we are coming down this hill and we're not coming slowly. Typically, it was about 2:30 in the morning when the stage descended Signal Hill on its way to the ferry. According to local historian John Rupp, even at 2:30 in the morning, John says, Van Buren was a very rowdy town, much more so than Fort Smith at the time. The businesses were mainly bars on the first floor and bordellos on the second floor. There was a domino parlor, a pool hall, but mainly bars in Van Buren. Van Buren was alive and well at 2:30 in the morning when the Butterfield stages came through. So at 2:30, arriving at the Van Buren port, they headed toward the ferry. At Van Buren, ferry carried the stage across the Arkansas River to Fort Smith, where it would merge with the stage that had been traveling from Memphis. The Arkansas River crossing here was difficult. On the Fort Smith side, there were mud flats exposed, and typically at 3:30 in the morning, a driver would meet them with a lantern to guide the stagecoach through the mud flats to get up onto dry ground to head the rest of the way into Fort Smith. In September of 1858, a passenger described what the ferry looked like at Van Buren. And he writes that he crossed on a flat boat, much resembling a raft. So something like the one pictured here. This simple flat raft was replaced by 1860 because a passenger, William Tallock, describes a rather high-tech raft at Van Buren. William Tallock describes in July of 1860 what the ferry looked like. He writes, in the evening, we crossed the Arkansas River on a ferry propelled by 2 horses walking round a sort of treadmill or nearly horizontal wheel, communicating motion to the paddles. This kind of locomotive power we had not previously met with, nor did we see any recurrence of it subsequently. Interesting high-tech ferry there at Van Buren. And according to reports from Van Buren's newspaper, the Press Argus, the ferry was seized and burned by General Blount when he marched his troops into Van Buren after the Battle of Prairie Grove in December of 1862. So our 91-hour trip from St. Louis is now complete. We've arrived in Fort Smith, where the offices of the Butterfield Overland Mail were, and that was at John Rogers City Hotel. Behind the City Hotel, Butterfield had stables with 50 to 100 horses and mules. They also kept a number of spare coaches and celerity wagons there because Fort Smith was the major junction point, the merging point, where the St. Louis and Memphis stages would meet and merge into a single stage before entering Indian Territory. And if the stage from Memphis had not arrived yet, passengers could rest and eat at the City Hotel. And Hiram Mumfield in June of 1860 says a word or two about the City Hotel. He was an employee of the Overland Mail. Hiram writes, "There are several hotels in this place. The City Hotel is said to be the best kept and affords accommodations with which I am tolerably well satisfied. The only drawback consists in the fact that the rooms, being extra large, contain 2 or more beds each, and accordingly, no one can get a room for his exclusive use. Well, we've completed the 91-hour trip. Only took us about 20 minutes, but we've completed the 91-hour trip from St. Louis to Fort Smith. And before we look at the route from Memphis to Fort Smith, let's pause and see if we have any questions. Anything about the route from St. Louis to Fort Smith, or just comments?
In the chat, there's a question, what's the address of Charles Butterfield's home?
Oh my goodness, my goodness. I do not have that off on the tip of my tongue. I'm sorry, I just don't have that. I've got it written down, but I just don't have it with me right now. So well, we're going to take a little break and watch a video here in a little bit. I'll see if I can find it during that break. It is, there's an art school there now. So I think it's the Fayetteville Art School, I believe it's called, in that location now. And the picture, the back of the house used to be the front of the house. The roads have changed, and the road that used to be in front of the house is now more or less an alley. So today you normally see the what Charles Butterfield would have called the back of the house.
Is it on the historic list of anything?
I don't know. I don't know if it's on the historic, if it's registered as a historic site. I don't know about that.
And Peter also wants to know, did many people die on the route to Fort Smith?
There were accidents. The worst accident was over in Indian Territory when a one of the celerity wagons, the mules got away from the driver and crashed into a tree, and a passenger was killed. I don't remember in any of the diaries or accounts of anyone being killed or injured headed south out of Fayetteville. But I'm sure it seemed even more treacherous at 1 o'clock in the morning in the dark, when you really couldn't see where you were going. You just knew the wagon was being tossed from side to side, and the horses were going over these rough rocks at breakneck speed. I'm sure it seemed worse, perhaps, than it actually was.
Well, last fall, I took a course from a local woman on the Butterfield Trail, in which we traced everything down from sort of the line coming over into Arkansas to Fayetteville. And I had been to Fitzgerald Station before, the barn there, but we stopped and I got to actually go inside it and take some photographs, which was great. And
still looks the same as the picture I showed?
Yes, it does. All of the, the boards are still there, and there's apparently some attempts to reformat it to make it into some sort of event center or something.
I hope if they make it into an event center, they don't gut the inside and put in sheetrock and
yeah, that would be too bad, because the inside was very interesting. If you like, send me your email and I will send you some of those photos if you want some more photos.
Oh, I'd love that. I'd love that.
Inside of, yeah, just you can send it through Sandra and she can get it to me.
I'd love to see those. Now that this is a National Historic Trail, Marilyn and I are working with the National Park System on trying to determine exactly where the route was, and suggesting to them interpretive centers, places where tourists could stop to get some more information about the trail. Part of what the National Park System wants to put together is sort of a recommended route from St. Louis all the way to San Francisco, from Memphis all the way to San Francisco, encouraging tourists to take that trail. And you could stop at Siloam Springs, at the Shiloh Museum on these hours on these days, and find out more about the Butterfield Trail. But they want to set up those kind of interpretive centers. And I think the Shiloh Museum, or perhaps even Fitzgerald Barn, might be a perfectly natural place to have as an interpretive center with the National Park System. Marilyn and I can suggest those, but that's way above our pay grade to make it happen. I would think at this point it would end up being at the Shiloh Museum, because there isn't staff or anything like that at the Fitzgerald Barn right now.
No, there's nothing at the Fitzgerald Barn or in the house they built later.
And when I stopped there last year, there's a young man who's been asked not to let folks, vandalize anything. He came out to be sure that I wasn't going to mess up the barn or anything, to find out who I was and what I was doing there. So it's kind of being watched, so it isn't vandalized.
Well, there is a small house back behind the bigger house that no one lives in, that is occupied. But I live along the Old Wire Road portions, between the Old Wire Road and Crossover Road. So there's some areas where the original Butterfield Trail goes shooting off of it.
Wow. When I go to Walmart, I drive on quite a long section of the Butterfield Trail here in Conway. It's fun to drive along that as it sort of winds through town, and to think that somewhere under this asphalt is the dirt once traveled on by the stagecoaches.
Well, I lived in Russellville for years, so I've also been to Potts End.
Yes, Potts End is one of the few sites along the whole 3,000-mile route that is still standing and unaltered. It's basically the same building that was standing there in 1858. Several of the structures, like there's one up in Missouri that's now a funeral home. And you can go outside and kind of see, oh, this portion of the wall used to be a part of the original station, but it doesn't look anything like it did in 1858. But Potts End is one of the few spots on the whole trail where there's something like even close to what it looked like in 1858. Anything else before we move on to Memphis? Okay. Well, let's take a look at the 91-hour trip from Memphis to Fort Smith. At the very moment passengers and mail were leaving St. Louis on Monday and Thursday mornings at 8 o'clock, there was another group of passengers and mail waiting to depart Memphis. And on this 1852 map, I've labeled 20 or so stations across the middle of the state. So let's start our trip from Memphis. We started at the post office, and this is what the post office looked like in 1862. Twice a week, 8 o'clock in the morning, mail bags would be carried from the Memphis post office to the offices of the Butterfield Overland Mail Company. And those offices were here at the Commercial Hotel on the corner of Front and Jefferson Streets. And D.F. Candy was the agent here at the Commercial Hotel. On the first day of operation, the mail pouch and the passengers left the Commercial Hotel and headed to the banks of the Mississippi River. On that day, and most days, the Arkansas River was not high enough for the steamboat to be used. And so the passengers and mail would cross the Mississippi. The newspapers report that it crossed on a ferry named Nashoba, Nashoba. The Memphis historian isn't sure that this is the Nashoba, but this is a Memphis ferry from back in that day that was used to cross the Mississippi. After crossing the Mississippi, and this departure spot and the arrival spot are from newspapers of the day where the ferry would depart Memphis. It would head toward Arkansas to Hopefield, Arkansas, which is kind of north of West Memphis, just a bit on the edge of West Memphis, where there was a train station, the Hopefield Depot. And the mail and passengers would be placed on the train. In Arkansas, we didn't have 168 miles of track like Missouri. We had 24 miles of track. But Butterfield took advantage of those 24 miles, mainly because those 24 miles were over what the maps called the Great Swamp. There on the far eastern edge of Arkansas along the Mississippi, swamp. And the train, for the most part, you can see up above what a train trestle looks like. Those 24 miles of track were on trestles going over the swamp toward Madison. So the mail and passengers got on the train for the short 24-mile trip, 2.5 hours to the end of the tracks. The first engine used on those tracks was called the Little Rock, was the name of the engine. And this is an actual photograph of one of the steam engines that was used on the Memphis and Little Rock Railroad. This end of the tracks at Madison, this is a photograph of Madison, Arkansas that shows the downtown area with the tracks in the process of being laid. Most sources call this picture Madison. I found one that says it's Forest City, which is just a short distance down the way. But this is when the tracks were first laid there in far eastern Arkansas. The tracks didn't go much farther than this until well after the Civil War. I think it's about 1869 when construction restarted after the Civil War and began headed toward Little Rock and then on toward Fort Smith. The 1858 newspapers state that at the end of the tracks, the mail was transferred to what the newspaper calls a light wagon. Now, it may have been a celerity wagon, we don't know, or it may have simply been a farm wagon, either with or without a cover, but it was transferred to a light wagon, quote unquote, to get through the soft, muddy parts of eastern Arkansas to get to Des Arc. It is about 50 miles from the end of the tracks to Des Arc, and so most likely the stage stopped south of Oakland and again south of Cotton Plant for a change of horses on the way to Des Arc. Reaching Des Arc, the White River, there was a ferry. This photograph comes from the museum there in Des Arc. Ferry was used to cross the White River. And it was here at Des Arc that the newspapers tell us passengers and mail were transferred to a stagecoach. So more the traditional Western stagecoach was used from Des Arc on to Fort Smith. The Butterfield home station was at the Jackson House, and the local library tells me that that is a photograph of the old Jackson House. Sad to say it was demolished in 2011, just a dozen years ago. The Jackson House had 12 guest rooms. It was brick. It was owned by M.M. Aaron. It was located on Main Street, about 300 feet from the ferry landing. And the dining room was framed addition to this building. It was 16 feet by 45 feet. And there was a second addition, frame building, 16 by 16 feet, where the Butterfield offices were kept. Leaving Des Arc, the stagecoach headed west 26 miles to Oakland Grove, and halfway is a community of Hickory Plain. I believe that the trail is now under Highway 38, but most likely it would have stopped halfway at Hickory Plain for a change of horses and to have the axles greased. And arriving in Oakland Grove, which is now called Old Austin, arriving at Oakland Grove, north of Clinton, this is a part of the old trail that is still existing there at Oakland. The Atlanta Hotel was there at Oakland. They also had a contract to be the station. They had 6 guest rooms, and a Masonic lodge occupied the second floor of the hotel. The community of Oakland Grove at the time had 150 residents. They had 3 dry goods stores. They had 2 boot and shoemakers, a harness shop, a tailor shop, a sawmill, grist mill, school, and a brass band. But that was Oakland Grove, north of Clinton. Now, as I said, the first month from Oakland Grove, they just kept charging straight due west toward Cadron, now called Conway. But after the first month of operation, the route left Oakland Grove and headed south-southwest through what we now call Jacksonville to Little Rock. Where Jacksonville is now located was an 1830 stage house called Gray's Stage House. And they were used by other stage lines. Most likely, Carolyn Kent says that the Butterfield stage would have stopped here halfway to Little Rock for a change of horses, since they were passing Gray's Stage House on the main road from Oakland Grove to Little Rock. Leaving Gray's Stage House and reaching the Arkansas River, the stage used a ferry to cross the Arkansas River. Up above is an 1866 sketch of Little Rock in the distance, with wagons waiting in Argenta, which now is called North Little Rock, waiting for their turn to get on one of these ferries. And you see a couple of the ferries, kind of flatboat ferries there in the middle of the river, to carry them over into Little Rock. And down at the bottom is the oldest picture I've been able to find of one of the ferries at Little Rock. And because of the steam stack, that one appears to be steam powered there at Little Rock. And you can see in the background there on the bottom, there's a steamboat, 2 steamboats pulled up alongside the banks there at Little Rock. And I recently discovered this 1855 survey that shows the exact location of the ferry crossing. And it is just about underneath the new Scott Street Bridge that crosses the Arkansas River, connects the Wyndham Hotel with the convention center. So that is where the ferry crossed. Here it is about 1,200 feet east of the old State House. And in this survey, you see the big arrows pointing to the ferry site. And off to the left, I put a small arrow pointing to where it says State House. That's the old State House that still exists there along the Arkansas River. But that's where the ferry crossed. And the reason the ferry crossed here was to reach the Anthony House, premier hotel in Little Rock. And this is a painting from 1864 showing the Anthony House, 3-story brick structure. This is a photograph of the very same scene from the State Archives. And this is where the Butterfield offices were. Joseph Ashley and Samuel Faust had the operation of the stables nearby. and they would keep 8 to 12 horses there ready for the next stage coming through. Leaving the Anthony House, they would recross on the ferry and then get on the old military road, that red line I showed you earlier, headed toward what we now call Conway. About halfway there, they would stop at a tavern. We think the first 18 months or so, they stopped at August Harchey's home for a change of horses. And then in 1860, Mike Sevier built this home, picture from 1930, built his tavern in 1860. And records seem to indicate that that's when the Butterfield started stopping at Mike Sevier's place instead of the Harchey place for a change of horses. Leaving Sevier Tavern, Harchey's Tavern, headed north, crossing Donald Ridge, where I lived for several years, and headed toward Gay Tavern, where I live now. This road is right near the old location of Gay Tavern, just alongside of Green Grove, which used to be Conway. Green Grove was the steamboat landing on the Arkansas River. This road goes right past that on its way to Cadron. And I see this road almost every day as I'm driving to Walmart. But that road still exists just like this. And you can look down the way and see grass growing up in the middle. That's very much what it looked like back in 1858. Traveling down this road, reaching the Cadron, passing Cadron Settlement, which was basically gone by this time. It was an early settlement on the Arkansas River back in the 1700s and early 1800s. Not much of it existed by 1858. But this is the site where they crossed the Cadron. We're looking into Conway County. I'm on a pontoon boat in the Cadron, but we're looking at the landing site on the Conway County side, where the stages would get off the ferry and then go up this ridge as they headed toward Plummer Station. About 9 miles away is the house of Samuel Plummer. He moved there about 1838 with his new bride, and he was a leathersmith and built a leather shop adjacent to his home. And this photograph was made about 1950. I was at the very same site in 2021 and took this photograph. We're looking at the leather shop straight ahead and his home, the station, there to the left. And there are very few structures in Arkansas that were witnesses to the Butterfield, used by Butterfield. One is this building we're looking at here. The other is just a few miles to the east, Kirkbride Potts' home. And then we have the stone barn there at Springdale, the Fitzgerald barn. And then also in Morrilton in Lewisburg, the relocated Markham Tavern is still standing. And we'll look at that here in just a few minutes. But those are the only structures used by Butterfield that are still standing in Arkansas. I'm sad to report that a year or so after this photograph was taken, this photo was taken by me. And the station had collapsed and caught fire. And I'm even sadder to report that that's all that's left now is what's left of the leather shop. A member of the family, David Plummer, is trying very desperately to purchase this 5-acre piece of land to save it and to save the leather shop for historical purposes. And hopefully that'll all go through. If anyone has $50,000 to help purchase those 5 acres, you could join with David Plummer and make that contribution to the history of Arkansas by preserving this before it disappears. Leaving Plummer Station, the stage headed toward the big steamboat port on the river of Lewisburg. This painting is believed to have been drawn in 1858. It is Susan Gordon's recollection of what the town looked like in 1852. But this is Lewisburg along the Arkansas River, now called Morrilton. At Lewisburg, the stagecoach stopped at Markham Tavern, owned by Reuben T. Markham. And this is the relocated Markham Tavern. After the Civil War, a soldier named Moose bought Markham Tavern, and as the records say, moved the tavern log by log, plank by plank, and reconstructed it 1 mile away along the railroad tracks. And it's now called the Moose House. And in fact, it's been turned into an event center. You can rent it for weddings or whatever. But I made this picture. It is still standing there in Morrilton at 107 Green Street. I do have that address here in front of me. And Mr. Moose's descendants lived in this house for over 100 years. And it was sold out of the family about 6-8 months ago. But it's now been turned into an event center. Leaving Lewisburg, headed west, the stage goes past Blackwell. These are some of the unpaved portions of the old military road as it goes past Blackwell on its way to Atkins. And those segments still exist. And then just in what is now the southeast side of Atkins was the community called Hurricane. And the stage stopped at the post office in Hurricane. Unfortunately, this historic structure disappeared last year. 9 miles away, the stagecoach stopped here at Pot Station, and this is now home of the Pope County Museum, or it's run by the Pope County Historical Society, I understand. It was built by Kirkbride Ponce in 1858. He got the money basically by taking a couple of cattle drives to California. He went one time seeking gold, but realized he could make more money selling cattle to the miners instead of looking for gold. And he made enough money on his trips to have his slaves build this home in 1858. Stagecoach would stop here not only for fresh horses, but they would stop for up to 40 minutes for the passengers to take advantage of the facilities. And we'll talk about those facilities a little later. They could also purchase a meal for 40 cents to $1. And at civilized stations such as Potts Inn, passengers came to expect a hearty meal of hotcakes, cornbread, biscuits, pork, fish, wild game, beans, bread, butter, sweet milk, and coffee. At isolated stations in the desert Southwest, the only food might be wormy biscuits and a bowl of grease-laden goat stew, but not at Potts Inn. Good food at Potts Inn. Also, the passengers were greeted in the parlor. This is the parlor at Potts Inn. Upstairs, passengers could, if they wanted to get off the stagecoach to rest, they could rent a room upstairs. There was a room with 4 beds in it where they could spend a night or two to relax. They could also purchase a bath if they wished to relax a bit before continuing their journey. And if our technology is with us, here's we're going to watch a video clip I made that talks about the next stop on the banks of the Arkansas River at Norristown. At Norristown, Cephas Washburn's home was where the stagecoach would stop and cross the ferry at Norristown to Dardanelle. And I made this video clip on the banks of the Arkansas River. My name is Bob Crossman. I'm a member of the Oregon-California Trails Association, as well as the Southern Trails chapter.
I'm standing here in the middle of Arkansas along the Arkansas River. We happen to know that this is the very place where the old military road crossed the Arkansas River. We're fortunate enough to have two maps, one from the 1820s, one from the 1870s, that shows the old military road coming down to the river, crossing on the ferry, and then going around Dardanelle Rock and headed on toward Fort Smith. In the 1820s, the trails in Arkansas were not much more than animal paths. And the federal government decided they needed a road, a passable road from Little Rock on to Fort Gibson in Indian Territory. And so charges were made, a decision was made to build a military road 24 feet wide, 6-foot ditches on each side, 3 foot deep, brush and trees carried leveled with the ground. And that military road came here to the Arkansas River, crossed here, and then headed on toward Fort Smith and then on to Fort Gibson. In 1858, the federal government decided it was time to improve mail delivery from the Mississippi civilization out to California. And so they contracted with a stageman named John Butterfield to carry the mail, the overland mail, in 25 days or less from Memphis or St. Louis all the way to San Francisco. When John Butterfield looked at Arkansas, how to get from Memphis to Fort Smith, of course, the old military road was the obvious choice. And so it was here where the ferry crossed some 520 times, carrying the Butterfield Overland stage across the river to continue on the old military road. We are fortunate to have a first-person record of a passenger on the Butterfield stage being at this very spot. He was a correspondent for the San Francisco Evening Bulletin newspaper, and this is what he wrote on arriving at this place. He writes, "The only place of any slight importance bearing any semblance of a village was Dardanelles." And that's where we're standing, Dardanelle, Arkansas. He writes, "which is nearly equidistant between Fort Smith and Des Arc, located on the Arkansas River. When we reached Dardanelles, it was late at night and raining in an old-fashioned way worthy of an 1849 memory. We were most unceremoniously turned out of the coach by the driver and delivered into the charge of the ferryman, who took the mail bags on his shoulder, his lantern in hand, and told us to follow him to his boat at the ferry landing about a mile distant up the river. There was no remedy for this unexpected tramp, and so placing our blanket on our backs and valise in hand, the passengers proceeded to accompany the ferryman through a torrent of rain, up the riverbank and across the stream in his small boat. It was well for the coachman that he could not be found, because he would have been roughly handed for turning us over this way. We all got soaking wet by the time we reached the coach on the opposite bank. 3 of our party were considerably used up the next day from the effects of the drenching." What a story. Crossing this river in the middle of the night, in the dark, and a torrent of rain, being entrusted to a ferryman and his little ferry across this Arkansas River on their way toward Memphis in this occasion. John Butterfield, in planning for the overland mail, knew about the old military road, but he had an idea. What if he were to take advantage of this river? What if he could use steamboats to carry the mail across Arkansas instead of stagecoaches? He wrote about what a relief it would be for the passengers, having ridden from San Francisco for 19, 20 days, bouncing around, packed together in a stagecoach. They could have a private cabin. They could have the luxury of a steamboat as they traveled from Fort Smith to Memphis. John Butterfield was so confident of this that in the summer of 1858, he purchased a steamboat called the Jenny Whipple. The problem was in September of 1858, when it was time for this overland mail contract to begin, the Arkansas River didn't cooperate. The water was so low that no steamboat could make it on the river. And so John Butterfield had to hastily contract with John T. Chittister of the Chittister Stage Lines to carry the first overland mail. John Butterfield kept hoping that the rains would come, the water would rise, he could go back to the steamboat plan. But in that first year, while he subcontracted with John Chittister, on only 4 occasions was he able to use his original plan of the steamboat. And so John Butterfield gave up on the steamboat idea, and he purchased horses, he purchased stagecoaches, he stocked the route from Fort Smith to Memphis with his own material and personnel. And so after 12 months, he let go the contract with John T. Chittister, and John Butterfield himself had complete control of the line from Fort Smith to Memphis. This is quite a barrier today. But in 1858, the Arkansas River was shallow, it was narrow, filled with snags. There were seasons of the year when you could walk across, certainly ride your horse across. Here, the water was unreliable, the bottom was not stable enough, and a ferry had to be in place to carry the overland mail across the river rather than simply fording. This is the story of the Butterfield Mail, encountering this river, finding a ferry across it so that it could carry the mail on schedule all the way from Memphis to San Francisco in less than 25 days. Ticket, $200 per passenger. Mail, only 10 cents. But the ride, it was not a pleasant ride. Crowded, 9 people on the stage, the front 2 seats sitting so close together, their knees were intertwined, bouncing, heads hitting the side of the stagecoach at night, trying to sleep, but they wanted to get to California. But there were also people in California ready to come home. The gold didn't materialize like they thought. And so there was actually a waiting list in California to get a ticket on the Butterfield stage. One man was going to have to wait weeks to get a ticket on the stage. And so he bought a ticket to ride on the back of the stagecoach in the boot, standing on the boot, all the way from San Francisco to St. Louis, Missouri. Cannot imagine. You might want to come to Dardanelle, visit the site, visit Potts Inn Station, just 9 miles down the road where the stagecoach stopped, and maybe even wet a line and see if you can catch a largemouth bass as well. Come visit Dardanelle, Arkansas.
Well, there we go. After crossing the Dardanelle Ferry and going around Dardanelle Rock, headed toward Stinnet's Station, seen here on, I believe it's called Highway 22. There's a historical marker there noting the site of Stinnett Station. And this is Nancy Stinnett. It was her aunt and uncle who ran the Butterfield Station. She was about 8 years old when the stagecoach started stopping at her aunt and uncle's house. West of Stinnet's, most likely the stage stopped at Shoal Creek for a change of horses and to have the axles greased. From Shoal Creek, the stage most likely stopped at Creole Station. 20 years later, Subiaco Academy was built about a mile to the southeast by the Benedictine monks. About 24 miles of the old military road survives, as seen in this photo, between New Blaine and Paris, Arkansas. West of Creole, the stage would have stopped for a change of horses at Moffitt's Station, which was located near this site. And then leaving Moffitt Station, the stage arrived at Charleston and stopped at A.J. Singleton's place for a change of horses. And this photograph was preserved by the Charleston Public Library. West of Charleston, the stage stopped at Oak Bower, where Strang Station was located. The hand-dug well still survives where the arrow is pointed. And the Strang family that lives in the house across the street still said that in 1954, an old wooden trading post building was still standing across the street. And the town of Lavaca later formed about a mile southwest of this site. A little farther west, halfway to Fort Smith, the stage may have stopped for fresh horses at the mercantile store owned by Aaron Barling, now called Barling. And then 16 miles farther from Strang Station, the stage arrived at Fort Smith, John Rogers City Hotel, where the offices were located. I found this map at the Fort Smith Museum that shows the location of the Rogers Hotel there at the top. And there was a fire in September of 1860 destroying Rogers Hotel. And so the offices moved to the bottom of the map there, actually a little closer to the river, to the St. Charles Hotel. And I took this photo a couple of years ago at the empty lot where the Butterfield offices once stood at the City Hotel. The stables then would have been the far side of this photo. Stages arrived about 3 o'clock in the morning. They merged together to start headed toward Fort Smith. A passenger wrote, "The stage stops at the City Hotel where most of the persons connected with the Overland Mail Company board. On landing at this comfortable abode, I was most kindly welcomed by Mr. J.K. McKenzie, the proprietor. Californians could not well fall into better hands, enjoy more pleasant quarters, or obtain choicer fare than they will find here." This sketch was made on the very first day of the Butterfield, sometime around September 23, 1858. Let me back up. September 21st, 1858, when the stage left Fort Smith headed west. And that sketch appeared in Harper's Weekly about a month later when it was printed, but drawn on the first day of operation. Any questions now that we have made our way back to Fort Smith? From here, the stage leaves Arkansas, and that's a subject for another day, crossing Indian Territory. Any questions about our trip from St. Louis and Memphis to Fort Smith?
Peter Tucker said people look like they're rioting around the Memphis post office. Are they receiving or sending mail or both?
When that drawing was made in 1862, I'm not up on Memphis history, but I think there was a rebellion of sorts. And I think maybe the post office was taken over by Southern sympathizers. But I believe that the sketch was made recording events that happened Civil War related next to the post office in 1862. That's when that sketch was made. Hello.
Hey.
Hi.
Hey, great job, Bob. I enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
How many people actually booked passage? It sounded like there were a lot of people coming back the other way, but I mean, was it?
The Butterfield offices printed a leather-bound annual journal for each conductor. And in that journal, they were supposed to record number of passengers, when they got on, when they got off, any accidents, arrival times, departure times, any difficulties along the road. And not a single one of those journals has survived.
Oh,
There is one basically empty one at the Smithsonian. A few pages have writing on them, but it wasn't by a Butterfield employee. It was sometime in mid-1860. A person used it to record their trip from San Francisco through Panama over toward Cuba. And so it doesn't help us at all knowing about the Butterfield, other than at least seeing what the workbook or the journal looked like. If you've got an old leather-bound journal that your great-great-grandpa, who was a conductor for the Butterfield, left in the attic, please let somebody see that. I mean, we need to get that to the Shiloh Museum in Springdale, in Springfield, and Springdale, and save that. But we have some scattered passenger lists. The newspaper in St. Louis was real good about sending a reporter to meet every incoming stage.
Wow.
And often reported what passengers were on the stage, interviewed passengers. I've got a whole book filled that I wrote, filled with the interviews of passengers from the stagecoach. And so we have a rough list of passengers, but really we don't know.
Right.
It made 520 trips, 260 east, 260 west.
Wow.
Could hold up to 9 passengers on the inside, not very comfortably.
Right.
In fact, the front 2 rows were so close together, their knees were intertwined. And so you think about sitting in this little box, is like a Volkswagen or a golf cart with 9 people, strangers you've never met before, so close your knees are intertwined, bouncing around 24 hours a day. But let's assume that every stage was full. 520 trips with 9 people in a stage, you've got a little less than 500 people would have traveled on the Butterfield. So that would have been capacity. Yeah.
Sounds like that train I was on in Czech Republic. That was a rough trip.
Memorable, wasn't it? So
yes. Oh, yes.
But they were not comfortable. There's a wonderful story about a person traveling from St. Louis toward Arkansas. And in the middle of Missouri, a family got on board, and the woman had the odious habit of snuff.
Oh,
and
gosh.
she had no regard for the clothing of the passengers concerning the spittle from her snuff. And the passenger records what it was like to ride with her, in her snuff spittle going all over the other passengers. Another great story about 2 children who got on board in Missouri, headed toward Fayetteville, and they got seasick.
Oh.
And they had no regard for the clothing of the other passengers and their vomiting. And so, it was not a pleasant trip.
Okay, I take back what I said about the train.
In the sand or snow, passengers were expected to get out and help dig it out and push it out of the hole.
Wow.
If there was a steep hill, passengers were often asked to get out and push to help the horses. If it was extremely hot or deep sand, passengers were asked to get out and walk behind to give the horses a break. It was like going through the Czech Republic. I mean, it was a rough trip.
Well, the train wasn't that bad, believe me.
You didn't have to push the train.
No, we didn't.
The stagecoach averaged 5 miles an hour.
Oh, wow.
And of course, that includes stops and everything else. And so, and the record is that in real smooth spots, they could go 12 miles an hour.
Okay.
And so, probably the stagecoaches were going 6-7 miles an hour most of the time, which is just a real brisk jog.
Right.
But that's it. They weren't going flat out, but they were moving right along.
So how many years did the Overland Mail run?
It started in September of 1858, and they had a 6-year contract. Okay. When the Civil War started brewing in February and March of 1861, the Confederates in Texas had a bad habit of stopping the Butterfield stage and confiscating the celerity wagons and changing those into hospital ambulances. And so with stagecoaches being stopped in Texas in March of 61, the federal government closed the line down, And I'll move some slides here to show you a map. That's what it was like sitting that close together inside the stagecoach. And there's getting the mud out. Oh, before I get to the map, this is a 5-hole outhouse. The word is at Potts Inn, they had a 6 to 8-hole outhouse.
Wow.
So that most of the passengers could get relief very quickly when the stage stopped. But that's getting a little friendly to have a 6 or 8-hole outhouse. When the and that's a passenger drew that in 1860, not 1856. In 1860, that's what it was like to sleep on board the stagecoach. There we go. The bottom line, the green line, that's the route. In March of 1861, the southern route was stopped, and the Postmaster General wanted to just cancel the contract. Because every contract the Postmaster General had, there was a clause that said Postmaster General may cancel this contract anytime he wants to for any reason. Well, when March of 61 rolled around, the Postmaster General was ready to cancel the contract, and the U.S. Attorney General notified the Postmaster General that he was going to have to pay John Butterfield's company $600,000 a year, whether they operated or not, because that clause had been left out of the contract. Now, whether it was left out by accident or left out of John Butterfield's, skill at negotiating, that's not recorded. And so, since the Postmaster General was going to have to pay $600,000 a year, whether they used him or not, they sent John Butterfield's company north to run from St. Joseph, Missouri to Placerville, California, on what's called the Central Route. And that completely avoided the southern states.
Right.
John Butterfield grabbed as many of his employees and equipment and horses as he could, but he did not capture enough of his equipment to run that entire line. He only had enough to run that red portion. And so he contracted with another company to run the blue part of the line, but he had the contract for the whole line, but he subcontracted the blue section. This was the very same route using the very same stations as the Pony Express. And up to this point, the Pony Express had been a private failing company near bankruptcy. And so in this contract, for the very first time, the Pony Express was now going to be a government paid operation. And John Butterfield was given responsibility to run the Pony Express. And so starting July 1 of 1861, Butterfield was also responsible for the Pony Express. And he also subcontracted that out to another company to run the Pony Express over those same routes with the same stations. And that lasted just a few more months until the first telegraph went in. And at that point, the Pony Express wasn't financially necessary because the telegraph could deliver a letter faster than the horse. Butterfield thought about running a Pony Express on the southern route. I mean, he already had the horses, he already had the stations, he already had the employees. It wouldn't have taken much of an investment to just have his fellows to run a horse express over that very same route, but he never got that put together. But that's why it closed, was because of the Civil War, and it got relocated up north into Union territory. Sorry, that's a lot of answer.
How long did it run totally before it ceased?
It ran the full 6 years. It ran from September of 68 until September of 64. And the Overland Mail Company ended, the contract ended, the company closed in September of 1864. The senior officer and I think one other officer formed a new company with a creative name of Overland Mail Company. They used the same name, but it was a different company. And they got some mail contracts and still ran a little bit. But the railroad was coming through. They that company sold out to Wells Fargo. I think it was in '69 when Wells Fargo had a great idea. They were only in the UPS shipping package business. And so about 1869, Wells Fargo decided, let's buy out all of the stagecoach lines in the West, and then we will be in charge of all the passenger transportation and all the package transportation in the West. And then it was like 24 months later, the train track was finished. And all of a sudden, Wells Fargo has almost an obsolete company. And so they started unloading all of those stagecoach lines because passengers, you could ride the train in a lot more comfort than in a stagecoach. There were still private stagecoach lines. I mean, here in Arkansas, there were still stagecoaches into the 1900s because, if you wanted to get from the train track to, the little mercantile store 25 miles away, somehow you needed a way to carry goods and people from the train tracks up to the little community. And so there were private wagon and stagecoach companies all over Arkansas up until the cars and gravel roads became more popular in the 1920s and 30s. And these private little lines, I mean, the train came through Blackwell, and your uncle had a mercantile store 15 miles north out in the boonies, and he paid you 25 cents every Tuesday and Thursday to bring him any packages that had come in on the train. And since you're going to be doing that every Tuesday and Thursday, going up there and back, you let everybody know in Blackwell that if you wanted to ride with me, for 25 cents, you could ride with me. And so you started a little business. You may only be 14 years old, but you've got a business going now, and started your own little wagon or stagecoach company carrying folks from Blackwell up to Springfield or wherever. But the state was just covered with these stops, and a lot of people think that the Butterfield stage stopped at their place because there was a stagecoach stop at their great-great-grandpa's. Well, that may have been a stagecoach stop, but it was 150 miles from the Butterfield route. It was one of John Chittister's stage routes, or it was, the little route you put together or something like that. But, that was transportation before trucks and cars became popular in 1920 and 30. By then, wagon business and stagecoach business really disappeared. Just like the river was the main source of transportation in Arkansas until the train came through about 1870. A lot of towns like Lewisburg, was as big as 2,000 people there on the Arkansas River, where Morrilton is now. The train came through a mile to the north, and so people started moving up by the train depot, literally dismantling their homes in Lewisburg and rebuilding them a mile to the north along the trail tracks, and Lewisburg just kind of vanished. In the same way that in 1970, when the interstate went through, a lot of our little towns along the interstate, they slowly began to move closer to the interstate exit. That's what happened when the railroad came through. That's what happened when the highway system came through. The interstate system came through. People just began to slowly migrate where the transportation was. Yeah.
Can I ask, do the books, the Treasury financial books for the Butterfield stagecoach line still exist anywhere?
They do, and they are being kept secret by the Wells Fargo company.
Oh, because you could figure out.
Well, the Wells Fargo company actually has the handwritten minutes kept by the Overland Mail Company national office, and they will not release that handwritten minute book because they say that was one of their former companies and that's proprietary information. Now, I do have a photograph or a photocopy of one of the pages out of that. It happened to be a day of dispute. John Butterfield was the president. A couple of Wells Fargo officers with the Bank of Wells Fargo were also on the board, and they attempted to take over the company. And they failed, but I've got the minutes from that page when the Wells Fargo bank employees made a motion to take over the company, and the vote failed. But
I would be more interested in the actual finance books that, like, the CFO would be keeping, because I'm imagine they made more money out of mail than they did passengers. But if you could look at all of the passenger receipts that are recorded in a finance book, you could figure out how many passengers they moved.
The historian for Wells Fargo, I have sent her numerous questions, and she finally wrote back and said that the minutes just don't record that kind of information. They're just full of financial figures. So, you know, yeah.
Well, the financial figures are more interesting than the minutes, I would think.
That's what we want. Yeah. And so, yes, they do exist. And someday, you know, we will have access to those. But Wells Fargo is, they won't let us see them. So I've had numerous communications with their historian. But, and the truth is, Wells Fargo never owned the Overland Mail Company. Butterfield's Overland Mail Company closed and dissolved in September of 1864. A couple of years later, Wells Fargo bought the Overland Mail Company, but they bought a different Overland Mail Company that was owned by had been started by a couple of Butterfield's people. But it had nothing to do legally or technically with the Overland Mail Company. But, you know, they just won't let it go.
If you could find and send out the address of Charles Butterfield House, I'd like to go by and look at it.
While we were watching the video, I went back through my emails with Marilyn, and that house is known as the Walker Stone House. And it is between Center Street and Mountain Street. Center Street and Mountain Street. What we see as the front faces Mountain Street, and what today they call the front faces Center Street. But it's the Walker Stone House. And again, it's a art school now.
I think I know where it is. I think it's part of the Fayetteville, you know, the community Fayetteville thing, leasing it out to art students at the moment.
Okay. It's a Walker Stone House.
Okay, I know where that is.
Between Mountain and Cedar Street. And if you want to see this picture, you have to be on Mountain Street, which I understand is more or less an alley nowadays. It's not much of a street. Okay. Anything else? If you want more information, I do have several books out on the Butterfield that you might want to look through. You can get signed copies by emailing me, or you can get these from Walmart, online, Target, Books A Million, Hastings Books, Amazon. 36,000 bookstores have my books on their website. And so you can get them from anywhere. But I'll be glad to send you a signed one if you want to contact me. So I've just finished one. It took me 2 years to make my way through Polk and Conway County, trying to discover the exact route. Part of that journey started for the National Park System, in trying to determine exactly where the route was. But in the process, I discovered Markham Tavern and where the stagecoach stopped. But before that, we just knew it stopped at Lewisburg, and it wasn't known in the Butterfield world where the stagecoach stopped. And then before that, this one came out on Faulkner County that details the exact route through Faulkner County and the city of Conway, exactly where the Butterfield route was. I did this for me, but also the park system. Since I live in Faulkner County, I wanted to know now where was the Butterfield route. And a friend and I, we tromped through lots of woods with walking sticks and trying to find remnants and wagon paths and all of that to determine that. But those resources are available too. Oh, here on the screen in the lower right is the conductor's book that's at the Smithsonian. And it had a map of the route and all of that, the schedule and everything was printed inside. But again, it's basically empty. You know, it says January 1859, you know, January 1, and the page is empty. January 2, page is empty. It just, yeah.
When I was
Well,
doing
thank you.
research down around in Pope County, I came across a little story about near Potts End where a father had to get after several of his children who were laying out in the weeds with his shotgun. And when the Butterfield stage was coming, they were scaring the horses with the shotgun blast.
No. Oh my goodness, I have not heard that.
Well, I'll see if I can dig it up and send it
Oh,
to
I'd
you.
love to hear about that. I would love to hear that one. Oh, that's a great one. That is a great one. It doesn't surprise me.
Well, I mean, if you laid around in the weeds and shoot the headlamp out of a train that was going through.
Yeah, I'm afraid kids do that too. So, yeah. When I lived up at Prairie Grove, it seems like back in the 80s,
Mailboxes.
there was someone up that way throwing rocks over bridges and hitting cars passing by. And some folks were badly injured, but that's the same sort of spirit as just, you know, hurling something at something passing by. Anything else in the chat box?
No, I don't see anything from Peter in the chat box.
All right. Any other questions or comments? So, well, we've completed our 2 hours together, and I appreciate you listening to the story. I hope you've enjoyed it. You all stuck with us. Nobody dropped off, which folks usually do during Zoom presentations. So thank you for hanging in there. And I've enjoyed telling you the story. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
all right. Well, you are welcome. You are welcome.
And there's Sandra with the off button.
There's Sandra. Hello, Sandra.
Hi. Hi, I just want to make sure y'all were good.
We're wrapping up our time together, and appreciate you, Sandra. So
Okay.
I think we've asked all the questions we can think of.
All right, well, I'm going to upload this to YouTube. Again, it's going to be a private link sent just to y'all, and you'll have about 2 or 3 weeks to go back and review it if you want to. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Sandra. We appreciate you.
All right, thank y'all.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.